The 1965 Voting Rights Act was probably the greatest piece of social legislation that was passed in the country.
The Voting Rights Act really revolutionized the process of political activity in Mississippi.
Had it not been for the Voting Rights Act, we wouldn't be holding any office. I wouldn't be here being interviewed as a senator for 24 years. It just would not have happened.
It transformed the South because for the first time, folks who were powerless had some semblance of power that they could bring to discussions relative to how communities were going to be run.
The 15th Amendment, it was thought, guaranteed the right to vote for African Americans, and that was settled. But the fact of the matter is, through the southern region, where most of this population resided, Reconstruction starts to ebb about 1875. And then 1890, the state of Mississippi rewrites its constitution and codifies what in fact has been a practice of disfranchisement.
Let's go to 1944 and Smith versus Allwright. Smith versus Allwright outlawed the white primary. And the outlawing of the white primary in 1944 was really the first monumental Supreme Court decision. That was the opening salvo that provided the pathway for blacks to become active in the political process.
It became obviously impossible for the states to limit the process whereby people voted in the state. And so we found ourselves going into the end of the 50s and 60s with an electoral process that still involved the state regulation of the participants by way of registering to vote, but which still excluded them in so many ways. And so instead of having several 100,000 black voters registered to vote, at the time of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, only about 25,000 were registered.
That a series of practices occur that effectively cuts off the vote.
When African Americans went to register, their names would appear in the local newspaper. And for many of those persons who were working for whites in the town, they lost their jobs.
For a population that doesn't have much education during enslavement, being able to read and write was barred. And so adding literacy as a procedure for voting was guaranteed to prevent a sizable number of people. Then there was a tax, the famous poll tax that required voters to pay a tax in order to register.
I would bring a carload of people down, up, wherever, to the courthouse in Holly Springs, and I would be leading 5 or 6 people. And the sheriff or the law enforcement would try to intimidate them or try to intimidate me.
All across the South, there were long voting forms. Mississippi had one of the longest forms, a series of questions to which you had to write the answers without any assistance from anybody. Didn't matter how much education you had, didn't matter whether you paid the tax. If the registrar declared that you were ineligible, then you were ineligible.
Impossible examinations and interrogations by registrars. How many bubbles are there in the bar of soap, or being able to interpret and recite every part of the Constitution.
How many jelly beans are in a pound of candy? How many feathers are on a chicken?
There were no correct answers. The only correctness was in whether the person that was administering the test wanted you to pass that particular day.
We just simply could not register to vote. They, would not even entertain you.
We began to ask our parents, how could this be that African Americans are treated so bad? They never done anything to anybody, and we had less than anybody.
My aunt, who lived in Montgomery, Alabama, went down 13 times. And they asked her, well, how many times are you going to come down to take this test so that you can get registered to vote? She said, until I pass it.
My father wanted to vote very badly, but his name was on the books. I don't know when they took it off, but he passed in '62, and the Voting Rights Act was passed in '65. And I often wished he could have lived until he saw the Voting Rights Act pass, and he could have gotten a chance to go up and vote.
There begins to be a national consensus, really, that the segregation system in the South is unacceptable.
There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem.
This act was a statute that finally had a series of enforcement measures attached to it, measures for government intervention that would allow a change to occur.
And the African American, just celebrated, had a joyful time that the Voting Rights Act had passed. And they could not wait until another election.
The policy decision was undergirded by so much struggle on the ground.
We spent a lot of time just doing voter registration training and also election day training, poll worker training. Once those folks went back, when they say, well, I went down and registered today, that means they're going to bring their cousins, they're going to bring their neighbors. Folks were feeling for the first time that they were more than 3/5 of a human being.
Well, after the law had been officially enacted, Mississippi white segregationists had little to no respect for the federal government. I remember just prior to the civil rights law being passed, testifying before the subcommittee in Washington about the need for federal examiners.
When the federal examiners came, we all knew it, and we went out to our meetings and said, hey, it's time. And folks said, hallelujah, when can we go? I said, well, they're open from 8 to 5. When would you like to go? Do you need somebody to come pick you up, or can you get your own transportation?
The people sent in to oversee the process into the voting precincts were resented, as you can imagine, by most white people. They felt it was an affront to the integrity of the state of Mississippi by having these people come in and, in effect, monitor the elections in a way that ensured that people who were supposed to vote and who were eligible to vote, in fact, got to vote.
My grandfather registered with the assistance of federal examiners. In 1967, he voted for the first time. In fact, he voted for Governor Winter.
The federal presence in the state in 1967 made a huge amount of difference in the number of African Americans who were able to vote and who did vote.
And by 1967, the first African Americans began to be elected to political office, the first time since Reconstruction.
Robert Clark was elected in November of 1967 as a direct result of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
When I first went to the legislature, I sat by myself for 8 years without a desk mate.
He didn't have an office, he didn't have a telephone, he didn't have a secretary. And I was with the Delta Ministry at that time, and we set up an office over on Ferris Street so that Robert could have an office with a secretary and a typewriter and could respond to the requests from people across the state who thought of him as their representative because he was the only one that looked like them.
To now have such a transformation where you have more black elected officials in Mississippi than any other state in the Union.
If the people's voices matter, then we need to do everything we can to guarantee that those voices can be heard.
The fact is, we have come such a long way. We ought to take a lot of pride in how far we've come. and the commitment, I think, now to include everyone in the process. But there's always that danger of slipping back, of assuming that we've achieved everything we need to achieve. We have not done that. We still have a lot of things left to do.
We saw 2 years ago, next month, the watering down of the Voting Rights Act with regard to cities and towns getting pre-clearance to be able to make changes within the Voting Rights Act.
In June of 13, when the Section 4B and Section 5, when the Supreme Court really gutted the act, those of us who were actively involved in registering people to vote under the act recognized that without Section 5, you do not have a Voting Rights Act.
The electoral process is the basic process that establishes the kind of society we're going to have.
Mississippi is the tip of the iceberg. Mississippi represents the potential in America for full participation by all citizens.